Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's study session. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes 3 study session items. Seeing there are no concept reviews on the agenda this evening, there will not be any public comment. You can watch study sessions live on Channel 8 and through video streaming on broomfield.org/council meetings. For our hard of hearing residents present, we have wireless headsets available in the back of the council chambers through our AV team. Our first item this evening is an economic and fiscal update and 2024 and 2025 budget highlights. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to summarize.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, council and community. Up first tonight is going to be Mr. Jeff Romine. As I'm looking at the budget team, I think our entire budget team is here this evening, along with Graham Clark. And Mr. Romine is going to kick us off with the economic overview. And Mr. Clark is going to take up the tail end, doing the overall on the budget. Floor is yours, Mr. Romine.
Thank you, Manager Hoffman. Mayor Pro Tem, council members, and those watching. I would just note that we'll be doing a very similar presentation to this on Thursday night here in these council chambers at 6 o'clock. We'll be going through the same thing. The public is invited to that, so that's really, but it'll be a very similar presentation using the same slides. But we'll be taking questions at that point also. So, or that point from the public. Next slide, please. So the economic update, I always like this, we always start this, this season, if you will, which is the council's review of the budget, and to understand what's going on with the economy, so you understand that foundation in which the budget can be constructed, both on revenue side, but also the impacts on expenditures. We always take a balanced approach here in Broomfield, and this has been going on for 30 or 40 years of making sure that we have both residential and business development going on, and making sure that that stays in balance, because it creates a positive fiscal outcome. It makes us sound, vibrant, and more importantly, and most importantly from a fiscal perspective, it allows council to make the decisions to achieve the community vision of the future. Next slide, please.
Mr. Romine, can I interrupt you?
Yes,
can we get our monitors on? Because they're not on. I mean, I can read that far away, but it would help to have the dais monitors. Oh, they're on. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Romine.
Magic. So I always like to start at this point with just giving you a sense of what's going on with the national economy, because it does impact Broomfield, as does the global economy and the Colorado economy. It sets the basis for what you're going to see and how we compare, which is oftentimes important. So as you know, GDP has come in. It's actually come in stronger than it did the previous year, same quarter, year over year. And so it's at 2.8%. So the economy is growing. At the same time, population has increased, employment is positive, and unemployment is still at a very low level at 3.8% nationally. The next 2 bullets are always important to keep in mind, because that's oftentimes how individual residents and families see the economy. And, you know, as an economist, you often talk about how do you feel an economy? It's not what we say. It's not what the Fed says or somebody else. It's really how these things impact a individual household or an individual community. So in this particular case, over the last year, wage and salary increases have been 4.2% at a national level, with inflation now at 2.9. So it's not, you know, if that wage and salary continues for another year or two, will it offset some of the inflationary pressure we saw a few years ago? Yes, but it is a very positive outcome right now. Same is true on the Colorado economy. I would note as I talk about this slide or this set of facts, and that is the Colorado economy actually came out of the COVID and the economic slowdown that we just recently experienced more positively than the nation did initially. Now we're slowing back to the nation. In fact, we grew just a little bit less year over year compared to the nation here in Colorado. So population growth continues. As you can see, the unemployment rate has risen to 4.2%, which is still a very low level. Oftentimes economists talk about that as the normal level of inflation or of unemployment is about 4%, somewhere between 4 and 4.5. And so that allows for the movement of people within jobs and to take new opportunities and some vacancies that are occurring. It was historically lower than that, but that is a normal, what's considered a normal level of unemployment. Again, the wage and salary increases here in Colorado have slowed to 3.6% this past year over year, but at the same time, inflation in the Rocky Mountain and the Denver area has slowed down also. So I would note as I talk about inflation, inflation is the change in prices, in the commodity prices. And so this is what's happened over the last year. That doesn't, I'm not negating the fact that there was a higher level of inflation. So we did see that budgets being stretched in difficult ways over the last 4 or 5 years, but it is moderating significantly. So next slide, please. Our economy is strong and sustaining. Recently, the city manager shared the metrics for the city and county of Broomfield. There were 3 or 4 economic measures that we put in there that show that relative strength of our economy. But here's a few highlights, both from the standpoint of a couple of additional facts, but also bringing forward some of those things we talked about in the metrics. Population continues to grow. Right now, the state and the Census Bureau believes that the population here in Broomfield is about 76,800 persons living in 33,700 households. So that gives you that. Of that, 41,500 individuals are working. So these are the people that are working that are living here. That's actually a really positive number. If you recall from the metrics, we talked about it, and you'll see that number coming up. But that's a higher level of employment per household than we see at the nation as a whole or at the state of Colorado or even in the metro area. So what that means is Broomfield is more productive, more engaged in the economy. That gives us economic resiliency, both as households, but also as a community. And that really is a positive. And that's something that has been that way and continues to be that way, and something that I've always focused on because it gives you that ability and gives this community the ability to thrive. It creates better markets. It creates greater opportunities for businesses. We all talk about it. It's that factoid that many people like to mention, and that is approximately 85% of our residents work outside the city and county of Broomfield. At the same time, that same relative share of people are driving into Broomfield each day or working remotely for Broomfield firms. Speaking of Broomfield firms, we have almost 3,600 now. That grew over 5% in the past year over year. And we have 43,370 people being employed by Broomfield firms. So those are people living in the other parts of the metro area as well as Broomfield. We have one of the highest average wages in the state of Colorado, as I've mentioned several times over the years. We're 25.3% higher than the state as a whole. So that's a composite number. What that really means is it's not that we're being unfairly compensated here in Broomfield. What that means is the types of firms that are located here and the types of jobs that are located here tend to pay at a higher level. They're higher educated, higher skill level, higher compensated. So we do have a range, and I'll talk about that in the next bullet. And that is as I oftentimes mention to you, we have a number of key sectors in our economy. Those key sectors include information services and technology, finance and professional business services, and also, of course, aerospace, which I don't list here, but there's a partial reason for that. And that is as we compare ourselves to the rest of the metro area, the total employment in the metro area, 20% is in those key sectors. And those sectors aren't just Broomfield key sectors. Those are key sectors for the state of Colorado, for the metro area. There was a phone call earlier today with the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. These are the key sectors they track, and they're very proud. And we all are very proud that those are the firms that are located and coming and growing in our communities. But here in Broomfield, it's 31%. So we're 50% higher. So that's part of that reflective of why. The reason why aerospace isn't necessarily listed out is, as was pointed out today in that phone call, aerospace here in Colorado is not just rockets or other things. It's actually the technology too. So it's some of those jobs are captured in the information technology sector, and some are captured in professional and business services. So those are congregated and collected. It's just easier to focus on those three because they're a little bit more distinct. Next slide, please. as I move into this section, the one thing I just want to mention, and you'll see this, but because we're going to start talking a little bit about some of the places where people work. But when I talk about the 43,370 people working for Broomfield firms, back in the 70s or 80s, that meant they all came here every day and oftentimes 5 days a week and were here 8 hours a day or 9 or whatever. In this day and age, in talking to the local firms, as well as looking at the national data and the state data, what we're seeing is this change in this movement toward a hybrid and remote work. So those 43,000 people are both working here in Broomfield, but also working remotely, oftentimes in other parts of the metro area. And talking to one of our leading firms, and actually one of the nation's leading technology firms, what they have told me is it's interesting. It's not even across all generations. What they have identified when they look at what their remote work and the employees that are choosing that, it's actually the persons over 50 tend to come into work and want to be here at least 4 days a week, but it's also the people under 30. So that's the generation that, quite frankly, went through COVID and learned in college or high school or wherever. They learned through a screen. They're tired of working through a screen. Many of those people want to have an association with people. They want to be mentored. They want to be developed, and they want to be part of teams. That's not to say you can't be part of a team remotely, but what we're seeing from the firms, and many of our firms are doing this, that is they're asking them to come in 2-3 days a week normally. And so that's that. I would just say, as many of you know, I live in a different community. And so I drive in every day because I'm one of those people that still believes you come to work every day. I don't need to, but I do. I don't know why. And everybody says, take a couple of days and work remotely. You'll be more productive. But the key here is if for anybody that's driving our roads in the metropolitan area, you will notice they have refilled. They are as congested as they were prior to 2019. So what we're seeing is people are coming. We have it from the transportation data. We see it from talking to the firms. And so we have a robust economy, but what we have is this movement toward thinking about work. And so you don't just come to work now through a vehicle or a bus, but you also come to work through your computer. And so that is the two ways we connect now to work with home. So I just wanted to take a quick sidebar because that's what we're seeing, and it's going to come up as I talk about a couple of these bullet points. Business growth, as I already mentioned, is 5.2% compared to Colorado's 5.8. Our average employment is nearly 12 compared to the state's roughly 11. So we have larger firms, and that partially accounts for that differences in the job growth or employment or business growth, but nevertheless, that's very robust and very strong. So we're still seeing business formation here in the Front Range and in Colorado and here in Broomfield. Again, I already mentioned the jobs housing relationship that we're at 1.29. As you can see, that's significantly above Colorado's and above the metro area. Here's where I wanted to pause for just a second because it's going to influence some of the things that we're talking about both today and tomorrow. And I'll reference this again later on, but I wanted to show you the data. In 2019, we had 18.3 million square feet of commercial space. This was the total commercial space. So this is office, this is retail, this is restaurants, as well as light industrial and flex. This is the total space. Of that, 5.1 million square feet is office. That was in 2019. This is physical. In 2024, we're at 20.8 million square feet and office is 5.6. So we did grow office over the last 5 years. But this is going to be important. As I mentioned, the remote work and hybrid is causing changes. It's also causing changes in the commercial real estate markets. And some of that has begun to appear, but what we're really expecting is more of it to come. So the market values, just to put it in relative terms, that was the market value according to our assessor, which are done under the rules and approaches adopted within the state of Colorado, but it's $2.56 billion now has grown to $3.46 billion. So you can see a significant increase in value. And you can see the increase in value also on the office side. So I just put those numbers there, not expecting anybody to remember them, but to recognize that this is, when I talk about some of these things, I would go back to the core data to make sure that I see exactly what's going on and I can share it. Next slide, please. These are the major influences affecting our economy, which therefore also then affects both our households, our businesses as well as our fiscal status as we look at the 2025 budget. Global and macro influences are real and here. This is not an esoteric thing. If you go over into the interlocking area, if you go around Broomfield, you will see companies that are headquartered here that are serving markets all over the world, such as Vail Resorts and others. You can also see international firms, Swiss firms, German firms, Swedish firms, Japanese firms, all having their North American headquarters or a major facility here. And we're proud of all of those firms. So that's our global connection. I oftentimes know that we're one of the top international communities in the state of Colorado from the standpoint of core business. Denver, Colorado Springs, us, and Boulder. We are the leaders in that global connection in so many ways. So as we're seeing the European markets, some slipping into recessions, others just going into economic slowdowns, Asian markets going into economic slowdowns, it will have an impact on our economy in 2025 and beyond. The high interest rates are still there. They're already started falling in the US. We hope the Federal Reserve Bank adjusts interest rates in the coming month or two. So we think that's right on the edges. And I think everybody is believing that's coming, and every indication of the comments that have been made by a number of the Federal Reserve Bank governors from all of the different districts are suggesting that is on the way. Consumer behavior and confidence. This is the part most economists are scratching their head on. It's still surprisingly strong. The one thing that kind of causes us to scratch our heads is the savings rates are falling and have fallen. So they've returned back to some of the lower levels that we experienced pre-COVID and pre-economic slowdown, but nevertheless, they are there. We are seeing shifting, and you'll hear that occasionally. You'll hear the most recent 10K reports that came through, the quarterly reports that came through, talked about some of the shifting and softening in some of the retail spending. In different firms, very strong firms, Procter & Gamble, Colgate-Palmolive, Coca-Cola, and the list goes on. So we are continuing to see that shifting, and that's something that we've accounted for and thought through. Workforce concerns, many people know about that, which is the softening job growth markets. That has happened. The last quarterly numbers came in, last month's numbers came in, and they're a little bit softer than a normal, but they're still positive and growing. But it was just below 200,000 for the last month. At a national level, we've been experiencing 250,000, 300,000 jobs on a monthly basis. The old pattern that we used to talk about was around 450,000 per quarter. So it's still positive and still in that range, but it's slowed down from what we're experiencing in the post-COVID era. And then finally, as I already mentioned, inflation is easing. Nevertheless, there is still high prices that many households are facing. Next slide, please. As we talk about and think about then the translation from the global economy and the national economy down to our local economy, it's oftentimes both a combination of consumer spending, business activity, but also development. And as we have referenced before, Broomfield for roughly its first 30 years oftentimes was a place of new development. Over the last 5 years, we switched into more infill and redevelopment. We're focused on the catalytic development of 3 to 4 major projects, 3 that we've oftentimes talked about, and the 4th that we're bringing on more this year. But throughout that experience and continuing today, and as council's indicated to the direction you've given myself and others, is keep focusing on balanced development. Let's bring in residential as appropriate, make sure that it's smart and thoughtful, but also make sure we're bringing on commercial and bringing in new opportunities for business. And those are happening. Sims Technology Park to the southwest, as an example, Connect 25, and some other areas, the Baseline Innovation, are just 3 examples of places where we're seeing business, we're seeing new development that will cause business growth, and where we're seeing businesses moving into those spaces. Many of you noticed there was a headline in this week's Broomfield Enterprise. Lightship came here and is located in the Baseline Innovation District. That's a great company that's really forward-looking. And if you haven't read the article, it's a really interesting article to talk about how they're thinking about tomorrow. Those are the types of firms we're talking about, and they're coming here because we have the right kind of space for them to grow into. Next slide, please. This is a quick snapshot. It's just a reference snapshot. As many of you know, I recently gave you an update on where we are on Broomfield Town Square. I provided that as a quick update last week. We'll be talking more about Center Street in the near future, and Flatirons Crossing. I think we've given you an indication in the metrics report, but they're prepared. They are now breaking ground and doing the horizontal work on the baseline or the Flatirons area redevelopment for that old village area. And then we expect to see the vertical start in 2025 on the first building. So all three of those are moving forward, and we've been providing normal updates. Also, we brought in all three of those developers, and they gave the council updates back in March, April, and May. So I don't feel a need to go into great detail because we've shared a lot about what's going on there. Next slide, please. Influences on the budget. This is my last slide. So I just wanted to kind of wrap it all up. So again, cost of services and programs will continue to rise, as you know, and as Graham and David will share, but as one of Graham's slides, he'll talk about the proportion of our budgets and how we spend it. So you'll see that labor is a significant portion of our budget. So that continues to be an influencer on where we can be on our budget and what our expenditures are going to look like. Labor availability is improving, so we're seeing some improvements on the increases in cost to labor, but nevertheless, for some jobs and some skill sets, it's still tight. So IT as an example, some finance positions, and quite frankly, some public safety positions. So in the metro area, it's still difficult to find police officers and sheriff's deputies as an example. And so we just have to be competitive in order to get the best employees that we possibly can as they come in the door and as we develop them and train them. Infrastructure costs. I oftentimes think about it, when we think about development, and as I work with the developers, the easiest place to develop is a greenfield. You get to put down, you get to dig up the dirt, you put in new pipes. It's pretty easy. You don't have a whole lot of complications oftentimes, and you don't have to kind of go backwards. When we do redevelopment, the infrastructure costs tend to be higher. You have to go in, you have to take out something, you have to kind of work through it. It's a whole reset. So it oftentimes, when we think about redevelopment and infill, but those costs tend to be higher for development. And at the same time, we have to maintain the existing systems, and it costs more than putting the initial. And so I just put that on there because it's reflective of where we are in a community, that we're no longer just a greenfield development community, but we're balanced in that same way between infill, redevelopment, as well as greenfield. And that will continue to be a pressure as we go forward in the next 10 years, 20 years, forever, quite frankly. Landing, construction, finance costs still continue to push housing prices higher for new housing. Hopefully we will see, as I mentioned earlier, some adjustments in the financing costs, which hopefully will bring more people the opportunity to do home purchasing if they so desire. Retail sales, we have looked at our data just last week on where we are in retail sales. We're positive. We continue to grow. And I'm happy to, as one of the things we look very closely at is both the types, but also the locations. Flatirons Crossing is our greatest retail sales tax generator, and it is growing. So the investment and the indications and the faith that this council and this community put in the redevelopment of that is starting to already pay. So I would just reference that. It also includes, of course, that they brought in some new tenants such as Lululemon and North Face. DSW's relocated into the mall. So we're seeing a strengthening of that really important asset of the community. I'm ending on property tax revenues. And the reason is because the general fund is, as Graham will point out, is primarily made up of different things: fees for services, use tax, property tax, and sales tax. Two of the largest of our revenue sources for the general fund, for the city and county budgets, is sales tax and property tax. I've referenced sales tax a number of times. I just want to conclude with property tax. It is historically, for economists, the thing that we love to talk about because it's the easiest thing. It's the most certain thing. It's the most forecastable item on all of public budgets. It truly is. It's my time in Denver, my time here is something that you just know. You can count on property taxes. They don't have that same fluidity that you see with sales tax. Now, the political environment, the policy environment, and now the commercial marketplace and residential marketplaces have changed that. So that is the most uncertain. And I don't mean that we're going to go backwards, but where we're going to be in 2 years, where we're going to be in 4 years. I spend a lot of time thinking about things like this, and it's more and more difficult to do this. So here's the two reasons. First off is in the 2025 to 2027, there's a lot of tax policy being discussed, both at the state level, even at the national level, but at the state level especially, including a special session that's now scheduled for next week. As many of you know, one of my tasks as an economist is to provide my best estimates, do some real research and try to figure out what it is. I've done that. And I've got 4 different scenarios right now. And knock on wood, I could have more. I don't know, but that's where we are. So I've done what I consider a pretty conservative approach. Here's the key thing though. There's the 2 combinations. There's 3 parts of property taxes that I always reference back to. There's the mill rates that local governments and school districts and others determine and impose and the voters approve. There are the assessment rates. Those are set by the state of Colorado under the way we have this system. And so those assessment rates, and there are some of these proposals are talking about adjusting the assessment rates and where they're going to be. That's not my place, but my place is to try to understand where they're going to be and then estimate what that looks like. And then there are potential growth caps. So those are the 3 variables that are all going on right now from a policy perspective. The one that's true for the economic perspective that I would throw out is the second bullet point, and that's the 2025 to 2029. As everyone has asked me over the last 6 months to 2 years, what's going on with office markets? What's going on with hybrid work? How is that going to impact our commercial real estate? So based upon those questions, I have done some work on it, but what we did is we engaged AECOM Economics out of Chicago. They're a consulting firm, part of AECOM overall, but they do the economic analysis. And we've engaged them to take a closer look at our primary commercial real estate market. And that is the Flatirons, Interlock, and Arista area. So that study is underway right now. We hope to have that report finished before the end of this year, and so we can inform it. The reason for doing it is understanding what the market pressures are, but also what that's going to do and how we can, rather than be reactive to a market, be potentially proactive. And that's what city councils oftentimes wanted to be, is proactive and cause change and influence it where we can. AECOM did a study on downtown Chicago. They've done a study in Texas. They've done some others. It is my belief, based upon my last conversation with them, this is the first time they've really looked at a suburban market. So this is a little bit different, but nevertheless, they've got the experience doing it. So what the impact is, remote work, hybrid work, how that's going to affect commercial markets, and how that's therefore going to affect our property tax revenues going forward, that's really the unknown. And then the second part of the unknown is, of course, where our appreciation is going to go on residential. And my sense is, in talking to Jay, our assessor, they have stabilized and are growing a little bit, but not obviously at the rate that we've seen over the last 4 years. Where will those be in 4 years and things like that? So I conclude on that because it's important to know that of our 2 primary general fund tax revenue approaches, that's really what the forecast is, and that's what influences Graham and David in the work and the entire budget team in their work. So at this point, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, and Council, for your attention. I look forward to your questions after Graham and David. So at this point, I'll introduce Graham Clark, our Interim Finance Director.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romine.
Thanks, Jeff. Mayor Pro Tem, council members, Graham Clark, Interim Finance Director. So we have in front of us the agenda for the fiscal part of the presentation tonight. We'll be looking at the budget philosophy, revenues, and expenditures as a preview of the upcoming 2025 budget. We'll have a grant update, including ARPA. We'll look at the CIP 2025 through 2029. And then we'll also look at next steps. We'll also touch on BURA and overall debt. We won't be talking about enterprise and rates. There's an upcoming study session in September, so it won't be the focus of tonight's presentation. However, we do hope that you'll join us tomorrow for the utility workshop that's over at the BCC from 5 to 7 tomorrow. Next slide. So here's a table showing our capital budget calendar. We have a simultaneous budget for the operational calendar as well. We do them at the same time. It really is a year-long endeavor at this point. We start in January of 2024 for the 2025 budget development. In the spring, CIP staff and department heads go through a prioritization process, including several internal meetings. The collaboration is extensive. And throughout the spring, there's a lot of details that we go back and forth on. Through late June and July, we develop a recommendation. We prepare that in August for bringing it before you in September, which we're on track to do. Wanted to shout out to the budget team that's right over here. They just recently battled COVID, almost all of them. And they've worked extra over the last couple of weeks to help us stay on track. And we are on track for delivering that on September 4th to council. Next slide. As you know, the number one goal of the community is fiscal sustainability and resilience. Staff takes this responsibility extremely seriously, and we come in daily to make that a priority. Some of the results of this approach can be shown here at the bottom in the bullet points here. In 2025 budget, we have programmed in a 20% operational reserve, which was a goal for the last several years. We've got an upgraded sales and use tax bond that's outstanding. That was upgraded last year, and now it's on the watch list to be upgraded again. We also have projected fund balance, including setting aside the property tax revenues from 2024. Next slide. This table here demonstrates the funding categories, and it allows us to reinforce that the funds are specific to their category. For instance, we can't use enterprise fund for governmental funds and governmental expenses. Fiduciary funds, which are over to the right, are pass-throughs to other entities. It's imperative that council understand that most of the property tax that we receive is actually sent out to the fire districts and the school districts. Next slide. Jeff touched on this a little bit as we look at both the 2024 revenues to date and we look forward to the 2025 budget. We're anticipating low but consistent growth. Property taxes, they don't have an assessment year in 2025, and so any increase will be mostly from growth and redevelopment. Sales tax growth is projected to have moderate growth in 2025 at 3.9% citywide. Next slide. Here you can see proposed 2025 revenues. It's similar to the 2024 revised. And on the right, you can see a table where the revenues come from. Jeff mentioned this a little bit earlier, but our charges for services is the number one revenue generator for the city and county. That is mostly your utility bills and your rec center services. Property tax, sales tax is second at 30%, and property taxes is the third revenue generator at 24%. Next slide. So now we're going to shift over to expenses by type. You can see over on the left, the largest component of the overall CCOB budget is the fiduciary funds. Those are the pass-through funds. That's the largest by far. And then we've got operations in there as well. The fiduciary funds, like we said, are pass-through funds mostly to the fire districts and school districts. But this is a good idea of what our overall expenses go to each year. And this is a 2025 as an example. Next slide. So this chart shows the expenditures with the fiduciary funds removed. The proposed 2025 budget, which will be viewable in a couple of weeks, has constrained expense growth. focusing more on reallocation of the current 2024 budget for 2025 amounts. And you can see the original 2024 and proposed 2025 are extremely close. The difference being the revised 2024 has additional capital, and that's the rollover that we do each year from capital projects that were not finished in that year and carry over to the next year. Next slide. So this slide shows that most of the governmental expenses are largely personnel related. And it really goes to the operations, the core operations of the city and county. Much of the budget in the governmental slides are fixed costs. So you got personnel, you've got HHS benefits and contractual services. A lot of those are fixed each year and don't change. Next slide. As we move over to the enterprise expenditures, this is the 2025 proposed. You can see that a large component of the enterprise is capital outlay. And then we've got contractual services as well. A big portion of the enterprise contract is a contract with Denver Water for water itself. So those are two of the largest pieces of the pie, as they say. Next slide. So as we look at personnel by itself, you can see that the FTE per 1,000 in population, which is a pretty common look at personnel from a city and county perspective, is just under 12 at 11.98. And you can see that that's consistent throughout the last several years. It's been in the 11s. No different for the 2025 proposed that you'll be seeing shortly. Next slide. So let's shift over to Borough for a second. We do plan on doing a Borough refinance at the end of the year. This will be mostly to move the variable rate, which it is currently, to a fixed rate. More to come on the demolition of that in a couple of weeks. But there is in 2025 in the proposed budget, there's a moral obligation. There's a shortfall of $1.5 million, and that will be needed to be covered by the general fund. Next slide. When we look at our Broomfield debt overall, you can see that the first three are general obligation bonds. And we've got a certificate of participation, which will be falling off shortly in the next couple of years. And then you can see the enterprise fund in green and then Borough at the very bottom. One thing to mention is that we will be intending to issue more bonds for the police and courts building in 2026, along with water and wastewater bonds in 2026 as well. That's for the water tanks and the wastewater facility. Next slide. So one feature that the finance department's been working quite hard on over the last year is a full inventory of all the grants that we have for the city and county. We've got that now. Here you can see all the CIP related grants. A lot of these are transportation. You can see 2024 and 2025 is what this encompasses. And we've got $18.7 million of grants, mostly federal and mostly having to do with transportation. A lot of those are 80% federal or state and 20% local match. Next slide. Then we've also got the non-capital grants. You can see ARPA funds, which is about 20.7 million, along with the Broncos settlement of about $1 million there. That's the large component of the non-capital grants. But we also have about $6 million outside of that of other grants that are from various departments, totaling $46 million of grants that city and county have. So we've been working on that pretty extensively over the last year, and we've got a good idea of all the different grants that the city and county receive. Next slide. So this is looking at the ARPA specifically. You might remember that we've gotten ARPA several years ago now. We're getting towards the end of that. ARPA funds are to be encumbered by December 31st of this year, and all funding for ARPA-related projects need to be spent by December 31st of 2026, which we're on track to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, David, and he's going to go through a couple capital slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark.
Mayor Pro Tem, City Council. I'm David Acevedo Yates, Deputy Director of Finance. First, I want to take a moment to thank budget team and truly the finance team as a whole. I have had the privilege in my career to work with some amazing people. I've been here in this role for 7 months, and I can tell you that the finance team here is no exception to that. Everyone that I have worked with and had the pleasure of getting to know is truly amazing, and the work that they do is truly valued by myself, Graham, and the rest of City Manager's office. So, thank you to all of you for your efforts. I'll begin here with the Capital Improvement Plan, or CIP. Similar to the operational budget, in reviewing CIP projects, we focus on our 4 buckets: mandate, obligation, critical, and other. Evaluating each project as part of these 4 buckets is vital to our understanding of Broomfield's responsibilities. Here we see CIP projects across all funds, including enterprise, are projected to, how each of these projects are projected to fall into each category in 2025. It is important to note that obligation and mandates are projected to make up 66% of the total CIP budget in 2025, which will be up by 10% over 2024. Understanding this breakdown helps our organization ensure that we are able to prioritize mandates and obligations while meeting critical needs across Broomfield and assessing our ability to take on projects outside of those 3 categories. Next slide, please. As we mature as a community, we have realized that we have our once shiny assets from 20, 30 years ago are not as shiny today. This chart shows our commitment over the last couple of years to go from new to focusing on repair and replacement of our declining assets. This is a goal of all CIP, including enterprise funds. The percentages here are by share of the CIP budget for each specific year. So while the budgeted CIP amounts in each year differ from year to year, the trajectories you are seeing are a reflection of our intentional decisions to use our finite resources to prioritize projects based on a review of our current assets first. In 2024, we are on track to be near an even split between new and asset replacement. In 2025, we project that we will not only cross that midpoint, but that we will shift to a primary focus on replacement and rehabilitation of current assets. This shift is important as building new assets quickly moves into maintenance of that asset and eventually replacement of that asset. As we reach build out and as we assess the ever-changing economic landscape, we have to change our approach to capital projects based on current relevant factors. Reviewing this metric periodically helps us make decisions that align with our priorities. Next slide, please. Here we have highlighted some projects in the general CIP budget that will be ongoing from 2024 into or beginning in 2025. As we can see, many projects span multiple budget years, and in addition, we must encumber the full project funds up front. The Bay renovation project, which recently began, is anticipated to be completed with a delayed start in 2025 with a target of July 4th. The police and courts building expansion is slated to begin design in 2025 with a budget of $3.8 million. This is only the design portion of the budget, and as design progresses, we will have a clearer picture of the total projected construction costs. This emphasizes the need to approach each project with intention and the need to plan years ahead and review and revise those plans as we move forward and as Broomfield's needs change. Next slide, please. In this slide, we focus on enterprise CIP projects. We can see the first phase of the wastewater treatment facility, which is planned to complete design in 2025 and begin construction in late 2025 or early 2026. This project, again, will span multiple budget years and truly underscores the importance of remaining disciplined in our approach to budget year over year to ensure we have the available resources throughout the life of the project. As Jeff mentioned, infrastructure maintenance and replacement is increasingly needy and costly. Our 2024 and 2025 CIP budgets reflect that, and our budgeting approach aligns our budget philosophy, as Graham outlined, with Broomfield's needs. Next slide, please. So here we have our timeline and next steps. On September 4th, we will have our 2024 revised and 2025 proposed operating and capital budget packets to council via email. We will make those available to the general public on September 10th. September 12th and September 19th, we'll have our 2025 proposed operating budget and capital budget discussions with our department heads. And then October 1st will be the first reading of the ordinance for the 2024 revised and 2025 proposed operating capital budget, including the utility rate increases, with a planned adoption by October 22nd or on October 22nd. With that, next slide, please. I'd like to thank you all for your time and allowing us to present here today. And I'd love to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't get your last name, but welcome.
Yeah, Acevedo Yates.
Yates, Mr. Yates.
Acevedo Yates, yeah.
You'll have to spell that. But thank you so much. That was great. So we will go to council questions and comments. Does any member have any questions or comments for our team? Well, I guess you answered everybody's questions. Councilmember Lim.
Thank you. Okay, I have several questions. Let's see. The grants, the slide on the grants. The speaker said that we have a better handle now on the grants that are incoming into the city. Do we feel like we have the resources to seek broader opportunities for grants in all areas across the city, or because there were some areas that weren't listed. There's a broader spectrum, I would say, of areas which are taking advantage of grants, but they're not all across the departments, I would say, yet. Can we expect that to expand further?
Thanks for your question, council member. I think it's reflective of the available grants. So not all these departments have a wide range of grants that are available. For instance, transportation does. CDOT has a lot of grants, and so it's well represented here. But I think it's pretty reflective of what's available out there in terms of state and federal grants. In terms of your question about do we have the resources, it's really department by department. And so although we centralize some of the grant management in finance, really it's up to the departments to kind of research, and we certainly provide advice and whatnot, but a lot of the departments have specific folks that are looking for grants and are looking to evaluate it for the appropriateness of Broomfield. We don't want to just go for grants that may or may not be easily attainable. We also review the grants on the work that it takes to get them and the administrative burden on departments. So we don't take just any grant, although that might sound fiscally imprudent. It's not, we don't want to bury our staff with trying to administer grants that are relatively small in nature. And so I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Romine mentioned, I think it was that mentioned our commercial base, and I've had questions from residents in particular in Lacamora who see empty industrial flex buildings and ask if they will ever be occupied. I mean, you sound optimistic about their future occupancy and their future revenue that they'll bring to the city. Could you address that?
Sure. Mayor Pro Tem, council members. So all real estate markets by asset types are always fluid and moving around. And that's one of the things that's definitely happening. So 3 years ago, there was a significant desire and demand for logistic properties. So therefore, of course, the response from the private sector was build more. And we saw that construction. What we're now seeing in flex and innovation space is much more like we're seeing with Lightship and others. And so right now, as you know, and as we've shared, we have several projects underway that are moving forward. They have the confidence of the financial community and the confidence of the development that they will be able to be occupied. We're still a shortage of certain types of space, but I just referenced back to 3 or 4 years ago when everybody, we weren't seeing any retail space being built, and now that is actually one of the tightest market classes of the commercial asset class. So part of this is creating the spaces that are desired by tomorrow. And that's really one of the most difficult things for the private sector to do, is anticipate where it's going to be. So what we believe and what we're hearing from the people that we talk to with the major firms that are doing commercial real estate here in the metro area, and specifically within Broomfield, is that type of building, the light industrial, is still in demand, and we will see those occupied. We do have permits. Again, I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the Sims Tech Park. They are planning to build 11 buildings. They have 3 under construction right now. So this is still a very positive and robust environment. We hear that all along US 36 and specifically in Broomfield.
Okay, thank you. One part of the property taxes that Broomfield receives that, as far as I know, will not be impacted by anything the state does is the oil and gas property taxes, because they aren't part of what gets adjusted. So I was curious, I can't find I found in the audit some numbers on the assessed value of the taxable property from oil and gas and up to 2023. And then I also found that extraction oil and gas was our #1 principal property taxpayer with assessed value in Broomfield. What I didn't find is anything in 2024 data that I could find in the projections that that I could find that projected if our revenue will still be, well, the assessed value from 2023 would be $400 million. Are we projecting what the assessed value will be in 2024 and 2025, and will it be somewhat consistent?
So Mayor Pro Tem, council members, Councilmember Lim, you hit one of those really interesting parts of property tax and the assessments here in Colorado, and that is oil and gas. The other one is the state assessments, the state assessed properties. And so while Jay, I don't believe, I think Jay's on vacation, if I recall. I'm looking at Anna, I believe he's out. So he'd be the perfect person. So I will defer to him a little bit, but I'll give you a little bit of inkling of my knowledge. So two things. If you go to our website, if you go to the assessor's website, you will see the certificate, or you'll see their estimates for 2024. Those are the taxes to be collected in 2025. So you can see the property value, the market value, as well as the assessed value. When you calculate those and you look at the summary tables, what you'll see is the oil and gas numbers for market value and assessed value are holding the same. So that's part of the reason why we show what we do, which is the 1% increase, is the stability of that, because there's not a reassessment. I will go one step further, and then I will be going too far out on the plank of my knowledge, but I will go one step further. And I reference state assessed properties in oil and gas. In working with Jay and working with the assessors that I've worked with, as well as the state assessors, they do them for those two asset classes. They're done differently. They are not based upon a real estate value. They're based upon the asset value. So oil and gas, the assessments are coming from the value of the oil and gas. So it will be a diminishing revenue source. It will be a diminished value source as we go forward, because those oil and natural gas, all of those kinds of wells will slowly will run out, at which point they will go away. So we saw a big jump over the last 3-4 years because of them all coming under production. We're seeing and capturing that value increase. It's coming through in property tax. The same is true for state assessed. So state assessed property is not based upon the value of the property. It's based upon the value of the company. So I learned this when I was working with United Airlines in Denver. It had nothing to do with the buildings or the airport or even the value of the planes. The value of the planes was based upon the value of the company, i.e., same would be true with some other things, that if the company is not making money, then the assets, the planes aren't worth much. And so that's what's true on both of these, is it is the value of the asset that really drives the property tax assessed value. At that, I'm stopping right there, because I think I have just gotten to the edge of what I know, but I will let Jay know that that's a question. He may follow up or correct something I've said. So thank you for the question.
Councilmember Lim, just some additional information. Once we received the information from Jay, we have a full, well, I'm looking at about 400 lines of data projections starting in 2024 to 2025. So we're happy to share those. It has been updated. We do a juxtaposition between the incoming funds as well as the expenses. And it clearly shows the diminishing returns, but it also shows that real spike, not just from the assessed valuation, but primarily because of the production. So it's the combination between the assessed valuation, again, without any of the equipment, combined with the slow diminishing returns from the and I'm just looking at it here again. We'll send that update to council, and you all can kind of dig into that and understand. It seems it's counterintuitive to think that the assessed valuation is 400 million, yet the revenues that we see we're anticipating to be about 5.4 million. So there's a lot of caveats in between the assessed valuation and what we actually receive. Particularly when we take out the additional mill levies out of our 28 for what that end result looks like. But we have a very thorough spreadsheet that finance has been able to keep updated with a summary of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. One question. On the 2025 or 2024, 2025 CIP spreadsheet list that we have, I was curious that there's at least 3 fairly large projects that are related to Broomfield Town Square already slated for 25. Are we really anticipating that those projects need to be completed in 2025 when BTS won't be moving forward hardly yet?
I'm going to start that response and then Graham can, and Ms. Allen is also here. If council will remember, when we were previously discussing BTS, there were 5 CIP projects that were extensive and required a great deal of engineering that was going to have to be done in preparation for BTS. It couldn't be done at the same time that BTS was doing its preparatory work regarding drainage and flow, underpass, sidewalks, all in preparation for their development. We wouldn't be able to do these CIP projects once the development was graded and actually going vertical. So those projects, and we have to budget for those, because with those big ticket items, it's not something that we can come up with in a year or 2 years or 3 years. Those are big ticket items that require us encumbering funds on the front end. That's why oftentimes it's a misnomer to see the amount of rollover in CIP thinking those are available funds, when in fact, they have been programmed. They just haven't been allocated. Ms. Allen, did I miss anything with that, please?
Hi, good evening. Katie Allen, Co-Director of Community Development. I'm not sure exactly which projects you're looking at, but the developer is constructing certain capital projects for Broomfield and will be reimbursed by Broomfield, but the improvement agreement requires some payments as they go. And so we are trying to make sure they're in the budget in case they do start. So it was a timing effort to make sure we had the funds available if they do start at any time in 2025.
So the Northwest Pedestrian Bridge,
Yes, that is.
is that one of them that has to move forward
Yep.
before they actually even hardly move forward?
Yeah, once they start, we start having to pay them as if they were a contractor rather than upon completion or acceptance, which is often the way we do it. And so we're trying just to program the funds to make sure they're available in that case.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Marsh Holston.
Thank you, Mayor. Going through the documents for preparing for tonight, I have a lot of questions related to stuff on the CIP project, as well as other things, water funds exactly in particular. But I know that those are probably better, both of those subjects are better for a different night. We have the water fund study session coming up in September. And on the individual specific questions on the CIP stuff, that's better for once the budget's actually released. So I'm gonna hold off on those. But I do have one question kind of going off of Councilmember Lim on the grants. I notice on the grant page, they are all, the capital ones, they seem to be all transportation related. And that's great. We need transportation money. But I'm curious to know if there's grant funding that we aren't going after or could go after related to other type of CIP projects. And I guess specifically to the enterprise fund. You know, I was sitting at a finance committee meeting with NACO last year, speaking to a gentleman from another state, you know, different circumstances, obviously, but they had to fund a new wastewater treatment facility, and they were able to finance a lot of that through grant funding. So I'm curious to know if there are funds available out there that we could go after to help with those type of non-transportation related.
Yeah, thanks, council member. It's a good question. The enterprise funds are certainly a lot less. You know, there was some grants that came out, but a lot of the enterprise fund grants are mostly related to need. And they look at specific income of the residents, think Flint, Michigan, and some of those types of places. So it's not the same as transportation in terms of how they divvy out their grants. It's a lot more based on need. I guess the one thing that we will be looking into is some of the subsidized loans that the grant that the state has. So instead of going out to the market and getting, say, a 4% interest rate, there's some specific grants. They call them grants, but it's really a subsidized loan where they subsidize 2%, let's say, of a 4% rate if you were to go out to the market. And so essentially you pay like a 2%. So it's kind of subsidized grant in that way. And that's something that we'll be looking into over the course of the next year as we start looking at the wastewater one specifically.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And then a follow-up on that, actually, not to shift gears a little bit. I know we all get the emails from Congresswoman Pedersen's office as well as the senator's office for congressional direct spending funding requests, which everybody used to know as earmarks. But Congresswoman Pedersen, my understanding was she had 15 different projects last year that she tried to get put in the budget that actually she got in, not that were other communities. Are there any projects that we can identify that you think that would qualify for a congressional direct spending request that we could get the funding from the feds?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question. I'm not sure those 15 and what those projects are, but we can certainly look into it and we will do that.
And one that I thought of in the past was, we talked about when the facility over by Boswan was being discussed, the residents came up and talked about how their sidewalks were non-ADA accessible. I don't know the numbers, and I don't know if you all know the numbers, but I imagine the cost to make those sidewalks accessible would be pretty extensive. So I'm curious to know if something like that could be a subject for a direct spending request, given that it's an ADA issue.
Yeah, I think a lot of those would be kind of under the transportation purview and CDOT. The ones that I've seen funded more recently are ones to help like mobile homes and that type of infrastructure related to mobile homes. And, they're kind of projects like that are maybe different than your standard projects. But again, we can look into that.
Those are only the general questions I have tonight. I'll have obviously more as the meetings go forward, but I appreciate the presentations you all gave tonight and the thoroughness of the information, and look forward to the upcoming discussions. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. So, it seems that with this budget discussion this year, it seems that we have the opportunity to not just look at budget numbers as we have in the past, and we'll get to look at those budget numbers in the future, but we get the opportunity to confirm our philosophy on the budget finances or budget and finances of our organization. So, I think that as we look through this, as for my council colleagues as well as the public, do we confirm that council will continue to hold high the community priority of fiscal sustainability and resilience? Do we confirm that we will continue to judge our CIP project focus by the buckets, those critical mandates and obligations? Do we continue to hold the compensation philosophy for our personnel, which is one of the large portions of our operating budget? Do we continue to push towards a more sustainable asset management philosophy and the funding associated with that philosophy? So we get to the opportunity to confirm, are we going in this direction with these philosophies, or do we need to change these at this point? And, from what I've heard so far, we aren't changing those philosophies, that we continue to go down the sustainable future. One of the big questions that came up as I prepared for tonight was the other bucket. The other bucket always strikes me as, when I look at financials, the miscellaneous line item, right? It's what is in that bucket? How do we define that? So, within that other bucket, do we have clear guardrails? Do we have it clearly defined so as not to be abused or hidden? Can you talk about more of those guardrails and definitions that are placed on this kind of other bucket that we have with the CIP projects?
Thank you, council member. If we can go to slide 26, please. So thank you for that question. It's a great question. And what we intentionally did here is actually define what each of these buckets in terms of the mandate, obligation, and critical categories are. The other is essentially in our definition is anything that does not qualify under the mandate, obligation, or critical. So while we use these buckets to sort of categorize each of these projects, I think the important factor in terms of the other is ensuring that we are able to meet our mandate obligations and our critical needs, and then assessing beyond that what those sort of non-mandate obligation and critical projects are. And so the guardrails in terms of that is that In terms of the CIP projects, all CIP projects go through the same process of evaluation once they move on to that step. And so we are still reviewing them in terms of these needs, but we are also reviewing them through the lens of equity and through the lens of fiscal sustainability. So hopefully that answers your question. Other than the definition of anything that does not fall into one of these three buckets, we can certainly pull some examples of what falls into the other for you and provide that to you so that you can kind of see what falls under each of those buckets as a project. So hopefully that addresses sort of the question.
It does help.
Okay.
Thank you. And I appreciate any additional information that we can get.
Yeah.
I think that,
Certainly.
for me personally, I think it's important that we do have some guardrails and some definitions assigned to that so that it doesn't have the appearance that that is just kind of a slush fund for any projects that is desired. But there is actually that we do continue to follow this what I would characterize as a sustainable future in terms of how we're categorizing these projects.
Staff couldn't agree more. I think Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf, part of so this is our third year utilizing those buckets. It has been a structural lift on the back end to ensure that our staffs are in alignment, particularly with how we define critical obligation and mandate. When we come to throughout the year, all policy decisions have implications on the budget. So when we are able to, on the front end, identify what those three buckets are, we're all speaking the same language, we all have the same vernacular. And when we're budgeting and those three are taken care of, that remaining amount is to accommodate shifts in policy and shifts from decisions that we hadn't accounted for previously. Much like housing decisions, where to fund additional initiatives and programs that come from the policy. As we've talked before, that really 2025 is the year that we will see not only more difficult decisions, but it's reallocation. So when Director Graham had indicated that we have reduced the number of budget revisions. I don't know how many in the audience. I know council has PTSD from the over 26 budget revisions that we've had in years past. The last 3 years, we've been able to condense those, which not only has been helpful for the public, but certainly for staff as well. So we're not constantly chasing something. With the more structure, with more transparency comes the opportunity, if you will, to make those discussions about reallocation. So you'll see the budget from 2024 not increasing, but staying relatively flat while expenses increase. So the revenue is flat, expenses are increasing, yet our budget remains fairly stagnant. That is because of a disciplined approach. So again, we'll become more acclimated to if something is desired to have happen, what isn't going to have happen, what isn't going to happen that's in the budget right now. So this really is our third year of having that structure to be able to have those types of conversations. And it will be then an ongoing discussion with the other bucket and what those conversations are, as long as we stay firm on the mandate obligations and critical, and those buckets and those definitions that have been clearly defined, and now budget teams are in alignment with that, and what they're producing from a department perspective is in alignment with that. It's really defining what that other is.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Mr. Romine, you had talked about the economic realities of Broomfield and they look good, especially in comparison with the rest of the state within the nation. But as you mentioned, the individual reality of the economy can look very different. And I think that, we continue to see that on a daily basis. Yeah, I was curious, as AECOM has studied the local suburban economy of Broomfield, are there some glimpses into these individual realities that might be different from that more macro level of local economy? So I don't know if there's any of those kind of realities that we can see on what it might be driving those individual realities.
So Mayor Pro Tem, council members, Mayor Pro Tem, I've seen a very simple first few slides of a draft. We're expecting it later this week, the first draft. But what we are hearing from them is there is concern, quite frankly, that the commercial marketplaces are adjusting around office, quite frankly, and the workplace. So that we have concerns around that right now. The good news is, from at least talking to them, is we're in much better shape than perhaps a couple of our sister cities, one to the north and a large one to the south, and their downtown areas and some of their office spaces. So we're in a better shape in a lot of ways, but we are seeing a weakness in it, and they're already doing it. The next step after they finish the data analysis, which they hope to have done in the next week or so, is then they'll do individual, I shouldn't say individual, but focus groups working with the owners of the properties as well as businesses within the properties in those areas. So a little foreshadowing of what's coming, what we expect. Manager Hoffman has suggested that we need to be done with this roughly around Thanksgiving, and that is what we've let our consultant know. So we hope to be coming to you early in 2025 to talk through all of this and then talk about what's going on. I have had conversations with a number of folks, myself in the commercial real estate, as I indicated, and we do see a softness, especially on the office side. And that is where the primary weakness is. That is one of our historic strengths. And we want to make sure that we figure out how to keep it as strong as possible. But it may not be at the level we've experienced in the last 2 decades, unfortunately.
Okay, so more conversations.
More
to come up
coming,
on this.
definitely before as the year ends, but definitely we are gearing up to this full presentation and discussion in 2025.
Okay, great. So knowing, and I don't know, Mr. Romine, if this question is going to be for you or someone else, but knowing that there's a lot of uncertainty in the future for our revenues, and it seems, maybe 2026 there are some more uncertainties than maybe we've had before. It seems that with the enterprise funds conversation to rely on the stability of the base rates, this gives more certainty in terms of our future, especially with that enterprise fund. But here, property taxes might not be as predictable or sustainable as they once were. How can we provide more certainty for our residents for the services that they've enjoyed and as well as they need?
That's a difficult question. I mean, part of that is why we're doing this work and trying to understand it. This is, from my experience, we have not seen anything like this, even during the Great Recession, which was the most impactful thing that we've seen on property taxes and property values in this region and, quite frankly, across the country. The one before that was the savings and loan in the late 80s and early 90s. And so those were the last 2 major real estate shifts that we've experienced. And this is something that's unknown and unseen. And it is taking San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, some of the great cities across the country that have been incredibly successful. And they are having to look at this foundational element too. So my role will be to give you the best practices. We're asking AECOM to look at that also. And we'll give you what we think is the best practices and approaches. But as I think many of you know, I've been an economist for over 30 years now, roughly 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. What we saw from the Great Recession and the impacts on both commercial and residential real estate washed through about 4 years later. I do not believe that's going to happen in this case. I think this is going to be part of the new reality. This is truly a new economy on property taxes. And I wish I could give you a silver bullet or a little bit of a glimmer of something, but I just can't. This is the thing that is concerning me the most of my professional career.
But it seems like that, the philosophy that we continue to practice and that we have adopted, primarily being that fiscal sustainability and resilience that has come from our community, even while revenues, are stabilizing maybe and have been high, that we continue to that belt tightening to ensure that we are fiscally sustainable and resilient, that we continue to grow our reserves, that we continue to have best practices in terms of stabilizing our revenues and stabilizing those funds to ensure that those services and those needed services continue. I mean, is that the trajectory that we have?
Mayor Pro Tem, I think you're absolutely hitting it. I think the policy conversation is going to be for this council, but councils all across this region and the state and beyond is that exactly that. And honestly, as I've looked at other communities, I'm an urban economist by training, and that's really where I've spent most of my professional career is doing that and financial economics. Broomfield is one of the few communities that's actually in a stronger place. We're at a stronger starting place into what may be coming. And if we think proactively and figure out how we can do it, and that's what council will be bringing to council, I hope that what we can do is minimize the impacts of what that negative is and figure out how to be focusing on the positives and how to grow our economy appropriately. It's just a different thing. This is a change. And I don't know a parallel that we've seen like this, as I say, in 50 years at least. This is the beginning of something different. And we just need to be reflective, and we will present that. The city manager and I've had some of these preliminary conversations, but quite frankly, I want to get the data. And I don't think that there is a quick silver fix to this. I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to work hard on.
Great. Thank you so much, staff. Appreciate it. That's all I have, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Feedback from council? Well, I do have a couple of questions about the timeline for the budget, and maybe Mr. Acevedo Yates. Yay. Can you please put up that slide with the upcoming budget discussions? Oh, perfect. Thank you. So the plan is to deliver a balanced budget by October 22nd. That's what we've done every year. We're required to do that. However, there's an election, November 5th, that could totally turn our numbers on their head. And like Mr. Romine mentioned, there's several ballot measures that could impact that, as well as another special session starting Monday that could further reduce revenues and alter assessment rates. So how are we going to address that? Because in one scenario, if one passes, it's 2 to 3 million. If it's another scenario, it's another 7.1 million. So you're looking at numbers all over the place, looks pretty volatile to me. And it's hard for us to budget with this amount of volatility. What do you think will need to happen?
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate the question, and thank you for getting my name correct. I appreciate that. I know it's a long one and a little hard. And I think your question goes also to Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf's question about sort of how we are approaching budgeting and how are we sort of putting confidence into what we present. And so I think going into this budget year, again, a lot of it is reviewing what resources we currently have and how do we use those and how do we leverage those moving forward. It's opening lines of communication with Jeff and his office, as well as Ken and the Public Works team and community development. It's a lot of this year has been building those lines of communication to ensure that we are understanding what resources we have and how do we implement them in the best way possible. Does that mean that that we are not going to have to make adjustments? Of course, we will make adjustments as we need, but having those lines of open communication help us address those issues, I would say, efficiently and more quickly than I would say we would have in the past. With that said, if election comes around and information changes, we are ready and able to make changes to our budget and to present that in a timely manner to council when it's so appropriate. So I hope that answers your question.
It does.
And in a timely manner would be first revision of next year. So we would not be doing anything after the fall. We would adopt it as is on October 22nd and make any revisions early the next year. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
And Mayor, one last thing, and it really does get to what you and Mayor Pro Tem are stating. When we look at that other bucket shouldn't be fungible. That other bucket should not only be clearly defined, the revenue that one of the reasons that our budget is primarily flat without any kind of spike or influence is we have to be able to absorb. So a lot of people talk about resiliency. We need to build for buoyancy, which is we know that we will go under again. It depends on what resources we have, what opportunities we have to have those cushions. So having that reserve is critical. And ensuring that that other bucket doesn't become a go-to. That there isn't we have additional, and I'm looking at our budget team that are shaking their heads affirmatively to be able to say, there is not a tree that we have not shaken. So we have built in anticipating 233 for the legislative outcome. So when we talk about expensive, when we talk about a volatility, one of the primary volatility is not only property tax, not only sales tax, any of those outside influences that we don't control, including mandates. And so when we think of mandates, we think of legislative mandates as well. So not just on the public safety piece, but a mandate is being responsive to that legislation. So we don't budget based on dollars that we don't have. We can estimate the dollars that we will have. But those three categories, which we're grateful for council for clearly defining those categories and continuing to utilize those categories, because then it allows us to be able to have that buoyancy, that we can hold our breath, that we can go under, we can maintain services until we're able to pop our head up again and take a breath. So we're feeling, I don't even want to say cautiously optimistic, because it's too volatile right now. There's too many things that can go in a different direction.
I'm glad you brought up that. So the reserve levels, can you expand a little bit more on that and how it impacts our ability to bond and the importance of having that 20%?
So if council will remember, we've had this, we started having this conversation during COVID, and oftentimes if you think about the simplest way to put it is for your household budget. A savings account is different than your 401k. So your savings account is something that is easily tapped into, covers budget shortfalls, and something that is quickly and easily replenished. A 401k is something you don't touch unless there is it's not just rainy day, right? But a tsunami has come and it's public safety related. That essentially, and I'm looking at our budget team, our budget team is shaking their heads. You start talking about tapping into reserves, that's a completely different conversation. It's one that pre-COVID, the standard was 16.7%, which is 2 months of your operating budget. When the community said, yes, fiscal sustainability is the #1 goal, one of our key performance indicators, among others, with keeping the ratio between commercial and residential, and having the first time for this council a debt policy. Through that filter, all things pass and have those conversations. Part of that debt policy conversation was shoring up those reserves. And to us, what that means is if you're indicating that 2 months of reserves pre-2019 was the standard, that clearly is not enough. The world has changed significantly to what that looks like. So instead of doing a pendulum swing, we started 3 years ago to take portions in order to get to the goal of 20%. We are on track for 2025 to be at that 20%. Right now, we're at 18%. Again, there are rules and regulations, and then there's self-imposed parameters, if you will, about what you tap into and what you don't. But thus far, the direction from council and the strong recommendation of staff is that you don't tap into those reserves unless it is public health and safety related.
And if I can expound on that a little bit, Mayor, one of the key variables that Moody's, which is like the main rating of bonds, they have a 20%, I believe it's 20%, don't quote me on that. Part of their variables that they look at is the reserves. And they look at 180 days. The 20% is definitely a good one. But they look at that and based on what they look at is managerial, it's under the managerial category, and it's reserves. It's also council's willingness to raise rates. And that's something that they look at. And all of this goes into, they've got various variables that go into this, but essentially that's where they get their bond rating. And so, you know, the lower your bond rating, the more we're going to pay when we do some of these bond issuances next year. And so we're trying to get that bond rating up. And that's definitely part of what we're trying to do is get that lower rate because you pay that over 20 years, right? So that adds up.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. That's all the questions I have. Anything else from the council? All right, well, thank you, and thank the entire finance team for coming to give us this information, and we'll be having plenty more conversations in the coming weeks. Thank you all very much. Our next and final item on the agenda is a discussion regarding council compensation. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Nikki Macklin is going to walk us through this item. She's the Director of Human Resources. Ms. Macklin.
Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and Council. If you'll go ahead and advance it to the next slide, please. Section 4.8 of the city charter provides that members of council shall receive such compensation and the mayor such additional compensation as the council shall prescribe by ordinance. Provided, however, that the compensation of any member during their term of office shall not be increased or decreased. In a recent study session on June 18th, Council conducted the required biannual review of Council's compensation ordinance. City Council discussed different adjustments to Council compensation with initial guidance directing that salaries for future mayors, Mayor Pro Tem, and Council be tied to a percentage of the County 2A salary for county commissioners. The county salaries are set by the Director of Research and the Legislative Council per state statute. At the end of the June 18th study session, the direction to staff was to prepare an ordinance for council's consideration that would adjust the compensation for future elected officials. There we go. Thank you for advancing that. Sorry. Just to walk you through it, the county commissioner's current salary for the 2A county commission are set at $125,394. So 75% of that was proposed for the mayor, 60% of that for Mayor Pro Tem, and 50% for council members. Obviously, if those were approved, those changes would only apply to newly affected officials going into positions in November of 2025 and November of 2027. Then on July 16th, Councilmember Delgadillo put forward an alternative proposal for a request for future action that suggests basing council compensation on a percentage of the AMI for Broomfield. And if you'll advance to the next slide, there you go. You can see Council Delgadillo's proposal here. It advocates fixing the mayor's salary at 60% of the AMI for a 3-person household, the mayor pro tem salary at 20% of AMI, and council member salary at 15% of AMI. The proposal suggests these adjustments would be automatically updated in line with changes to AMI, ensuring that compensation remains aligned with local economic conditions. As with any change to the mayor's compensation, if approved, again, these would not apply to current council, only to newly elected officials going into positions in November 2025 or November of 2027. Following Council Delgadillo's proposal on July 16th, council requested that we schedule this particular study session to discuss this matter in greater detail. So with that, I will turn it over to council.
Thank you very much, Ms. Macklin. So we'll go to council member discussion. Who would like to kick it off? Councilmember Delgadillo, you have the floor. Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that. I was struggling to find the stylist doodad, but we're getting it. Doodad, that's right.
I lost mine too.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, so I did want to start this discussion because I was the one who proposed going back, fixing things to AMI. I thought that would align us, like as discussed, along the economic conditions of where we are in Broomfield. I also did want to provide us some insight into what this breaks down to an hourly wage as well, right? So when we look at these numbers, how much are we actually saying that someone should be working, and how do we feel they should be compensated for that sort of work? So I brought up these numbers because I thought they were pretty reasonable. I will say that obviously a lot of things have happened since then. I know we have discussed water rates and things like that. The one thing that I really did want to stick my neck out for, though, is to say that the mayor works a full-time job here. The work that the mayor does, whether it is Mayor Castriota or anyone else, is going out, being part of state boards, doing the sort of advocacy for Broomfield. And I think that it's very important that at some point we strongly prioritize actually aligning pay with the effort that goes into that role. So I did really want to advocate for that. I realize that budget is limited. But I did think that if we can only move on one thing, that would be the one thing I would really strongly push for. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Marsh-Holden.
Thank you, Mayor. I was obviously the one that pushed originally to discuss the extra AMI way back when we first talked about it, and then Councilmember Delgadillo had some other ideas, which I appreciated. I'm withdrawing my support for this proposal completely right now. Given the budget and the enterprise funds and everything else, the water rates, I can't in good conscience support this discussion right now until after we fix the issues at hand. Let's get through the budget cycle and the water rate issue, and let's figure that out before we ever talk about this. I do stand behind the discussion that next year, this discussion should happen, but it should happen in the context of what does the community want a council member to do? And you all know that I have pushed in the past that I do believe that we should have a more dedicated council. I do think recent events have demonstrated there's a need for that. A council that has the time and the energy and the dedication to really dive into what is necessary for this job. So I do think that discussion should happen next year. I do think the salary discussion should happen at the same time. I think that's appropriate. But right now, I can't support going forward with it. I'm not opposed to Councilmember Delgadillo's discussion on the mayor. I think I agree that the mayor works very, very much full time, and all mayors do a lot of work, or they should at least, because they represent the community not just up here, but in events and different things. So if that one, I don't know. I support it, obviously. I don't know if now the right timing is right now, but I guess that we'll see what the rest of the council wants to do. So those are my thoughts. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Henkel?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, no, I agree. I feel, and we talked a little bit about this last time, that now is not the time. I think we need to punt it for next year. I also think too, we need to really define not only what Councilmember Marsh-Holston said, what the community wants us to do. Because on one token, I have a member in my ward who says I spend too much time on my full-time job, but that is what pays my bills. And it's interesting that they also want me to be paid less in this job. And so there's a lot of conflicting information as to what even one person in my own ward wants. And it's highly frustrating for me because I don't think a lot of people know exactly what we do. While the mayor, I agreed, this is a full-time job for them, mainly because they're more of the, I wouldn't say a figurehead per se, but if someone has a question, they generally want to go to the mayor. She receives likely 3 times more emails than we
10.
do, 10 times more emails than we do, because she's been a city council member before, and now she's mayor, and now she's experienced this. And I would like to garner information from past mayors and past council members, but at the same time, we hear from past mayors and past council members, but they also don't understand, and maybe maybe we're not communicating this well enough, what kind of demands that we have here. And so if you want me to represent, let's say, something that is more federally moved, so if we talk about things that are more federally driven, and you want us to represent that, and you want a member of your council to do that, I've heard time and time again that people want us to move forward in some of those boards. Additionally, some others can represent boards because we're representing those people in our community who want that representation. So I think it garners information from the community on how they want representation, how many hours they feel that we should dedicate, and we also should communicate how many hours we are dedicating already. There should be a limit to how many boards possibly that we can belong to and perhaps receive compensation for. But I do believe that if someone, on our board wants to serve on, like, let's say the tax commission, perhaps they should also have that compensation. I know it's a volunteer effort, but at the same time, I don't think people really understand that when you represent your community, you have to represent them beyond just what you see here at the dais. And I think that, we need to communicate that better. And I feel like us as a council needs to communicate that better. I also think we need to figure out sort of the roles of a city council member and as a county commissioner. I don't think that was quite understood at the time we became a city and a county. We wanted all of these rights, but then with it came a lot of these responsibilities. And I don't think that that was really, and that changes from year to year. I mean, you just heard Jeff Romine talk about how the political landscape changes around us, and we had to fight so many times at the Capitol for our local rights here. And so things change around us, and you have to be malleable and change with them. And so I would like to see this moved next year, and then also talking about even maybe a third party looking at this. We've learned our lesson with our water rates too. We need a third party looking at the information at hand, who we represent, how we're representing them, and a third party to really look into what are the roles that are different between even Denver City and County, and what does that look like in other states too, and their representation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other council member comments, questions? Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I will just briefly say I appreciate this change in focus, and I will gladly pick this up again next year. And I still appreciate the pay we've been given. We looked at that in 2020, and I thought we had a good direction where it was indexed, and I would support though more pay for the mayor. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Yes, I appreciate that the proponents of these two different scales have reconsidered under the circumstances at the moment with the funding questions. I generally do support the increase for the mayor. And I'm wondering if we move this to next year, is there a time frame that we would have to consider it in order for it to be effective with the November 25 election?
Thank you, Councilmember Lim. It would need to be in effect by the election date. So that would put it at the very last meeting would be second reading or potentially third if there were amendments in that late October meeting. So we meet our publication date. That would be the very latest it could be done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Ward joining us remotely.
Thank you, Mayor. I in the past, like Councilmember Marshall, have advocated for higher pay increases or higher pay rates for city council members and the mayor. We do a lot. I mean, even including city council members, there are many of us that represent not only on local but regional and statewide boards, partially by assignment. And I think right now is not the appropriate time to consider pay changes for members sitting on council. So I will be withdrawing my support.
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Ward. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just note, I was not in favor of having this discussion tonight, but I'm glad to see we've changed course. I do think it was premature because we have another process going on to do a job description for city council, and it seemed like that should come first. That's the cart before the horse situation. It's reasonable, though, I would say, to examine council roles. Fort Collins did that. They're the ones who went to an AMI basis for paying their council members. Westminster's on the verge of changing finally to a ward-based system for their council, which should dramatically change the representation on that council. There is cost too. I mean, we have 10 members, and through 10 members, we're able to have probably one of the most diverse councils in the state. And if we cut those numbers down, we'll lose that for sure. If we make the job more demanding, it may become more and more hard for some of the people, such as renters and younger people, to be on this council. So I think it's a good discussion. As I said, it's premature. I support what Councilmember Lim was getting at, that maybe after the job description is written, we can have some more public discussion and see where that leads us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cohen. Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. So I was not in attendance in person or virtually on June 18th. I reviewed that meeting after the fact, and quite frankly, I was flabbergasted by the rates that were proposed by my council member colleague. I very much appreciate Councilmember Delgadillo's thoughtful approach and willingness to rethink this compensation philosophy for council. I am surprised by my council colleagues that who have insisted on this conversation happening and now are changing direction. So I'm surprised by this move. There was mention of the public's view of the mayor and council, and perhaps that can be defined more clearly in these job descriptions as recommended by the Charter Review Committee. I believe there was a public meeting that was held to discuss this last month. I don't believe that was recorded or minutes were taken where the public can get caught up in a conversation, but I do think that needs to happen so that if that is going to be part of this conversation, that gets done soon. I would agree that this is my third mayor that I've worked with. The demands of the mayor are great. It involves a lot of daytime work. It involves a lot of evenings and a lot of mornings as well. Again, all three mayors that I've worked with, the demands are high, and we do need to think about that compensation philosophy because there is a choice there. Broomfield expects a lot of work and a lot of time for our mayors, and yet we are not compensating that mayor when they cannot have a full-time job to offset that cost. So we do need to think about that and figure out what that compensation philosophy look like. The proposal that Councilmember Delgadillo does starts to move in that direction to compensate the mayor in place of that full-time job that they are unable to take because of the hours that the mayor is expected to work. So I do appreciate Councilmember Delgadillo for your thoughtful approach, and I do support that we continue to look at the mayor's compensation. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf. Any other feedback or comments from council? Well, as the person who does the job, I've talked to a lot of other mayors and I think what it comes down to is the opportunity cost of doing the job. Because doing this job means you're not doing other things like earning income, a living wage, being able to help your partner with expenses, but it's a choice, but it comes with a cost. And it's an economics term that's called an opportunity cost. One of my colleagues told me that she won't be running again because of the high opportunity cost that comes with this role. So something to think about. I appreciate the support of the council and recognition of the growing demands of a city this size. And I do it willingly and out of the goodness of my heart, because I don't think I've ever been more gratified by any work. So just thank you all so much for that conversation. And I don't know if you have direction or not on what our next steps are.
Mayor Pro Tem, we'll probably put this on a coordination agenda in early 2025 and just look at our schedule. We'll make sure to keep Nikki Macklin and Pat Gilbert, who usually drafts the ordinance change, in the loop, and keep that timeline that Councilmember Lim raised in our minds.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you, Ms. Macklin. Thank you, Ms. Rogers, and thank you, council. That concludes the agenda items for. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. There's a hand up. Oh, I didn't see it. It was blended into the trees. I'm so sorry, Councilmember Leslie.
No, that's fine. Mayor, I'm just being very quiet tonight, but I just want to go along and support my colleagues thinking about deferring this until next year, but making sure that we do address the salary for the mayor in particular. So thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective.
Thank you. Well, that does conclude the agenda items for this evening's study session. Is there any other business to come before the council from my colleagues or staff? Then there being no further business, the study session is adjourned. Thank you all for joining us. We will be convening into our executive session shortly. Thank you.